The night was dark and rainy in Crestwood, a sleepy suburban community. Emma and her younger brother Max were spending the weekend in an ancient but attractive two-story house when the rain started to pour in buckets and thunder rumbled in the background. The siblings had to fend for themselves when their parents took a much-needed vacation. Emma was in her poorly lit living room, thumbing through her phone as midnight approached. For hours, Max had been deep asleep, and the only sound coming from the rooftop was the constant patter of rain. Even though Emma was a tough adolescent, being by herself in the ancient house during a rainstorm felt unsettling. She was always aware that someone was observing her. In an attempt to divert her attention from her mounting discomfort, Emma chose to switch on the television. She flicked through the channels only to see late-night chat shows and infomercials. She turned it off out of frustration and made the decision to go upstairs to her bedroom. A brisk wind caused the drapes to sway as she ascended the rickety wooden stairs, giving her the chills. Once in her room, she closed the door and secured it. Emma tried to read a book for a time to distract herself from the unsettling environment, but she found it difficult to focus. The storm outside had gotten worse, and her chamber was illuminated by sporadic flashes of lightning that created unsettling shadows on the walls. It was 2:0 a.m. on her bedside table, and she was getting agitated more and more. She was about to give up and head downstairs to see how Max was doing when she heard something that made her shudder. It was the sound of footfalls, soft and distant, coming from her room's corridor. Trying to tell herself it was all in her head, she held her breath and strained her ears. However, the slow, purposeful footsteps persisted, getting closer. Emma was so terrified that she grabbed her phone and rang 911. The police were on their way, the dispatcher informed her, but it would take some time because of the storm. For now, she was by herself. Emma took a thick book off her bedside table and carefully opened the door because she knew she had to keep Max safe. Her heart fell when she gazed into the dim hallway. Nobody was present. Taking a deep breath, she tried to center herself and tell herself that she was wrong. Maybe she was just being tricked by the storm. She went outside into the corridor to see how Max's room was doing. He was sleeping comfortably, oblivious to his sister's terror. Emma made the decision to head downstairs to double-check that all the windows and doors were locked. She couldn't help but feel uneasy as she went down the steps, like if someone was watching her. Emma stopped when she got to the bottom of the steps. The front door was flung open, the wind howling through the foyer, rain pouring in. She was overcome with fear and started yelling for Max. Heart thumping in her chest, she ran into the living room. Max had left. Emma began to panic as she looked around the home frantically, but she couldn't find Max. She didn't know how he'd vanished from view so fast. His moist footprint that led from the front door into the house was the only evidence of his presence. Emma's mind reeled from all the possibilities. Was there anybody home? Had Max been taken? Emma took up the phone with quivering hands and phoned 911 once more. She told the dispatcher what had happened, her voice cracking. She was reassured by the operator that the cops would show up right away. Emma realized she had to find Max on her own. She couldn't wait for them. She went into the pouring rain and got a flashlight from the kitchen. She cried out for Max when the light beam penetrated the shadows. She felt shivers down her spine as the wind howled through the trees, producing an eerie symphony of sounds due to the unrelenting storm. Emma was walking around the yard when she noticed a dark figure standing close to the edge of the woods, illuminated by the flashlight. With a gasp, she cried out to Max, but the figure remained motionless and unresponsive. She approached warily, her heart racing as fear welled up inside her. She screamed in horror as she finally got to the figure. It was a life-size doll with a message attached, drenched from the rain, and it wasn't Max. Emma's hands shook as she opened the paper, and when she saw the terrifying phrase, "Come play with me, Emma," her eyes dilated with fear. As with her head racing, she staggered back and realized she had to return to the house. The flashlight flickered and faded as she turned and ran toward the house, leaving her completely in the dark. The wind seemed to be whispering dark secrets in her ear as the storm seemed to be becoming worse. Once inside the house, Emma began to feel more and more anxious. She couldn't get rid of the impression that she wasn't alone as the sound of dripping water reverberated throughout the quiet rooms. After moving upstairs, she went to her room and shut the door. She was frozen with fear and the room felt oppressive. Emma waited for the cops to arrive and the minutes seemed to drag on forever. Her phone's battery had run out when she attempted to call them again. She held the thick book tightly in her hands, prepared to protect herself if needed, as the only source of light was a weak desk lamp. Abruptly, a barely discernible whisper began to float across the room. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she strained to listen. Max's voice could be heard calling her name. Her ears were playing tricks on her. She thought he was actually in the room with her. "Emma, where are you?" She felt compelled to shout out to him since the voice seemed so close. "Maxime, I'm in here, Max. Stay put, for I'm coming." Emma's heart leapt for joy as she opened the door and hurried into the hallway. However, the voice seemed to fade as she approached it, taking her on a spooky, winding journey through the creaky, dark house. Emma followed the whisper like a helpless moth to a menacing flame as it reverberated from room to room. She was guided farther inside the home, past dingy alcoves and forgotten dusty areas. The voice was constantly out of reach, as if taunting her. Emma began to feel uneasy as the house turned into a maze. Her quest for Max had turned into an unending nightmare, and she had lost all sense of time. She was being drawn farther into a trap, and couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. The muttering voice became evil as she proceeded into the house's darkest corner. It laughed, a shiver running down her spine due to its chilly and icy laugh. "You ought to have stayed in your room, Emma. It would have been best if you had concealed." Emma was devastated. She became aware that the house was not her alone. She was being cruelly tricked by someone into a horrible confrontation. She was forced to keep going in an attempt to locate Max and get away from her unseen tormentor. Emma finally found herself in the basement after what seemed like an age. The weak light revealed a scene that horrified her, and the air seemed musty and moist. With his eyes wide with fear, Max was strapped to a chair. Beside him was a figure shrouded in shadow, with their face hidden. Max whispered, "Emma, help me." Emma felt her heart quicken upon realizing they were in peril. Lifting the thick book, she prepared to stand up for her brother. Emma gulped in shock as the shadowy figure started to move forward and into the faint light. There was a man with a menacing smile on his face. Emma felt a shiver run down her spine. His eyes were soulless, empty pits. Emma realized they were in serious danger as he brandished a knife. The man stepped forward, and Emma gave the book her whole might, hitting him in the face. Max let out a terrified cry as he stumbled backward and dropped the knife. Emma hurried up to her brother's side and struggled to take off his shackles. However, the man remained unfazed. With a look of rage in his lifeless eyes, he lunged towards Emma. In a desperate attempt to survive, they struggled with one another. Emma was determined to keep Max safe, so she battled with all her might. With their weapons drawn, the police stormed into the basement during the fracas. The man was soon brought under control, and Max and Emma were released from his hold. The questions persisted even after the nightmare had finally ended. A startling revelation came to light during the police investigation. Somehow, amid the storm, a weird and insane man had found his way into their home. He had been hiding out in the most inconspicuous areas of their house, observing and biding his time until disaster struck. Emma and Max were traumatized by the experience, but they were thankful to be alive. The family started the gradual process of healing once their parents went back to their house. Once a haven of solace, the mansion had turned into a disturbing reminder of the atrocities they had experienced. The awareness that darkness may lurk anywhere, even in one's own home, was ultimately the actual horror of that night, rather than the storm or the menacing stranger. Emma and Max would never forget the night they were pursued by an unseen guest. They had learned a dreadful lesson about the frailty of the human soul. It was a crisp autumn night, with the sun barely setting and long shadows sweeping Hollowbrook House. The Jackson family had owned this historic Victorian home for many generations, but young Sarah Jackson had never been left home by herself. Sarah was left to take care of Tommy, her younger brother and the house while her parents were in the city for a business conference. The idea of spending a weekend alone thrilled Sarah, a mature and responsible adolescent. She had written a list of everything she intended to do: host her friends over, order pizza every night, and binge-watch her favorite TV shows. She was elated by her newfound freedom. With the passing of the evening, Sarah became comfortable in the warm living room, encircled by the well-known creaks and moans of the ancient house. Turning on the TV, she attempted to immerse herself in a sitcom, but something felt strange, causing a tingling sensation on her skin. The heater was on, but the room was still cold, and the lights flickered here and there, creating unsettling shadows on the walls. Sarah wrote off these strange happenings as peculiarities of an ancient house and blamed the darkness outside for her discomfort. Nevertheless, she was feeling queasy in the pit of her stomach. Sarah went back downstairs at around 10 o'clock in the evening to see how her brother Tommy was sleeping. Aside from the sporadic rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl, the night was quiet. Tucked into a warm blanket, she nestled up on the couch and tried to concentrate on her TV show. Then, though, she heard an odd sound. It was a delicate melody, like to the gentle tones of a music box. Perplexed, Sarah sat up. She strained to hear where the music was coming from. It appeared to be emanating from inside the house. Sarah nervously took up her phone and called her mother. The call ended up in voicemail right away. She wrote a note in which she described the enigmatic music and her mounting discomfort. Before going any further, Sarah made care to take out a bulky flashlight from the closet. The music grew louder and pointed her in the direction of its source as she made her way down the darkened hallway. She followed it to her late grandmother's room's door. She had not seen her grandmother in years, and the room had been sealed ever since. Still, it sounded as though the music came from within. With her heart racing in her chest, Sarah hesitated. With shaky hands, she pulled open the door and swept the room with her flashlight. It held family antiques, old photos, and an antique music box sitting on a dusty shelf. A small dancer was twirling to the eerie sound inside the music box. Perplexed as to how it could have begun on its own, she reached for the music box and turned it off. The room belonging to her grandma had always unnerved her due to its voluminous curtains and antiquated furnishings. However, something much more unnerving caught her attention as she turned to leave. A message inscribed in dust on the mirror. "Welcome home, Sarah." A shudder went down her spine and her heart began to accelerate. Tommy was fast asleep. Her parents were out of the home, and she was alone in the house with no explanation for the message. In an effort to keep as much distance as possible between herself and that unsettling message, Sarah fled the room as soon as possible and locked the door behind her. Once back in the living room, she attempted to soothe herself by blaming the music box incident on a technical glitch. She invited her buddies over VSMs so they could stay with her. Knowing that she wouldn't be by herself for too long was a relief. But as the minutes ticked by, Sarah's discomfort came back. She couldn't get rid of the unsettling feeling that someone was watching her while the lights kept flickering. She looked at the old grandfather clock in the corner of the room. The faint, repetitive ticking of the clock's pendulum contributed to a mounting fear. Then, an unexplainable incident occurred. Her breath created misty clouds in the air, and the room felt as though it was getting colder. She was horrified to see the wall-mounted temperature gauge fall. The heater was still running, but the thermostat indicated 50 degrees. With fear pulsating through her, Sarah made the decision to take Tommy and leave the house. In a hurry to rouse Tommy and make their getaway, she hurried up the stairs and flung open the door to his bedroom. However, what she saw next stopped her cold. Tommy had left and his room's window was wide open, letting in the crisp fall breeze. She scrambled about the room in a panic, but her brother was nowhere to be found. She contacted the police with shaky hands, and they showed up at Hollowbrook House minutes later. Sarah was inconsolable as she attempted to clarify the events to the police. They looked everywhere in the home, but Tommy was nowhere to be found. The police told her to spend the night with a neighbor and promised to use every resource at their disposal to locate her brother. Sarah hesitantly consented, packing up her belongings from her childhood home because she didn't know when she'd see her brother again. The community was shocked when the Tommy disappearance inquiry produced no leads. Sarah blamed herself for not being able to protect her younger brother, which left her feeling hopeless and filled with remorse. The family was shattered by doubt and anguish as her parents hurried back home. As the weeks stretched into months, Hollowbrook House became an increasingly unpleasant place to live. Sarah's parents were unable to part with the house because it included too many special memories for them. However, they were aware of the peculiar happenings that Sarah had mentioned. The temperature fluctuated, the lights flickered, and the constant sense of being watched did not go away. Her parents were sitting in the living room one evening when she heard a quiet, spectral voice coming from the house. Tommy's voice could be heard, pleading for Sarah. Her parents also heard it, and they looked desperately for the source, but they were unable to locate anything. Their son's voice seemed to have taken on a frightening quality within their house. Sarah never lost hope of locating her brother during the passing years. Determined to find the cause of the weird happenings in Hollowbrook House, she carried out more independent research. One day she discovered a secret compartment in the wall while organizing her grandmother's room. She found newspaper clippings, old letters, and diaries within. They disclosed a sinister family secret. There had been several generations worth of mysterious disappearances from the house. She learned more and more about the terrifying past of the house as she dug deeper into the past. The house's foundation was rumored to be cursed, and it was built on the location of an old burial place. There had been decades of Jacksons living there, and generations that had simply disappeared. Because Sarah was determined to know the truth, she sought advice from psychics and paranormal specialists. They verified that the house had been under a strong curse for ages, and that there were evil spirits residing there. It seems that her brother's disappearance and the unexplained events were caused by the ghosts. Sarah came up with a strategy to lift the curse and release her brother's spirit in collaboration with the experts. They faced the evil spirits that had plagued her family for so long by performing a number of rites and ceremonies. It was an intense event full of horrific encounters and paranormal activities. However, Sarah's bravery and tenacity ultimately paid off. The ghosts that had been haunting Hollowbrook House for many generations were exiled once the curse was lifted. The house's sordid past had finally been banished. But Sarah's family was irrevocably altered. They knew Tommy was at peace, but even so, losing him was like losing a wound that would never completely heal. The enduring force of curses and the strength of familial ties were both demonstrated at Hollowbrook House. The house's terrifying past had been unearthed, and its mysteries exposed, but the wounds from the past would never fully heal. The Jackson family will always carry the eerie memory of Hollowbrook House as a lesson that certain mysteries are best left unsolved. The Harborview apartments were tucked away amongst tall skyscrapers in the center of the busy metropolis, the newest structure to grace the city's skyline. This sleek, modern structure had all the conveniences one could ask for. However, the opulent exterior of apartment 303 concealed a terrifying truth that would permanently alter Lily Mitchell's life. Mitchell had just moved into the apartment. Young and driven, Lily had moved to the city to pursue her dream profession as a graphic designer. She was overjoyed to discover a cheap, reasonably priced condo in the Harborview complex. With her family located several hours away, Lily experienced a renewed sense of self-reliance. Her welcoming neighbors welcomed her on the day she moved in and gave her a sense of comfort. She believed that she had made the proper decision because they had reassured her that Harborview was a friendly and safe neighborhood. However, Lily started to notice something odd as the days stretched into weeks. Everything began with a slight scratching sound that seemed like it was coming from the walls. She thought it was just normal apartment noises at first, but it soon started to get louder, almost like a whisper in the walls. Lily made an effort to ignore it, but the sounds kept getting louder and more regular. The sounds became more ominous as the weeks went on. Strange, inexplicable thuds and muttered whispers would wake her up in the middle of the night. Lily talked herself out of it, telling herself that the stress of her new work and her strange surroundings were just tricks on the mind. But something made her blood run cold one evening while she was making supper in her sleek, open-concept kitchen. She seen a shadowy figure cross the living room and vanish down the hallway out of the corner of her eye. Her heart was racing as she whirled around, but nobody was there. Lily attempted to explain the experience by blaming it on her vivid imagination and tiredness. Perhaps it was just a trick of the light, or the movement of shadows from the streetlights nearby. She dismissed her discomfort and carried on with her evening. Lily couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her that night as she laid in bed. With the exception of the faint brightness from streetlights peeking through the drapes, the room was completely dark. Her mind racing, she glanced at the ceiling, attempting to piece together the identity of the dark figure she'd seen earlier. Then she heard it again, the faint, clear whispers, only stronger this time. When Lily realized the noises weren't coming from a nearby apartment, but rather from inside her own, her heart skipped a beat. She strains to listen, but the words sound foreign and incomprehensible. Lily sat up terrified and flicked on the bedside light. The voices stopped abruptly and she was left in a spooky silence. She took out her phone, dialed the front desk, and informed the building's security of the issue. A security guard showed up at her door in a matter of minutes, and they conducted a thorough check of the apartment. But they didn't discover anything strange. She was reassured by the guard that her apartment was secured, and that no one could have entered without authorization. Lily took the guard's assurances, relieved but uneasy, and watched him go. She went back to bed, locked the door, but she could not fall asleep. She felt exposed and defenseless after the events of the evening. The strange events persisted over the course of the following few days. Lily would get a spooky feeling in her flat, see shadowy figures, and hear whispering. Her sanity started to suffer from the persistent feeling that she was being watched. She thought about leaving, but her lease was just for a year. She decided to look into the history of the Harborview Apartments because she was desperate for answers. She learned that the structure was built on the site of an old factory that burned down badly at the beginning of the 20th century. There had been a great loss of life, and the scene was marred by tragedy. Lily, determined to find the origins of the haunting, contacted a local historian who focused on the history of the city. The historian attested to the fact that a horrific fire that claimed many lives had in fact occurred at the old plant. There were rumors that the deceased souls continued to haunt the place and try to make their presence known. Lily discovered that apartment 303 was situated right above the location where the factory's basement had formerly stood as she dug more into the past. The historian forewarned her that when their bones were disturbed or their stories untold, restless spirits frequently attempted to make contact with the living. This revelation haunted Lily, so she decided to investigate further and, in a frantic attempt to find answers, she contacted a psychic medium. The medium arrived at Harborview Apartments, and she felt a sudden wave of dread upon entering apartment 303. According to the medium, the ghosts of the factory workers who had died in the fire were imprisoned inside the structure and were trying to communicate with the living. She thought that the voices and whispers, the shadowy shapes, and the scratching sounds were these lost souls trying to reach out. Lily and the medium came to the decision to perform a seance in order to assist the spirits in finding closure and moving on. The medium got ready for the ritual as they assembled in the living room. Uncertain of what they would find, Lily felt a mixture of anticipation and worry. The room got colder and the atmosphere seemed to thicken as the seance got underway. The ghosts were invited to communicate by the medium calling out to them. Subsequently, the room's shadows appeared to come to life, blending and forming unique shapes. Speaking first, the medium communicated messages from the spirits. They were desperate to put an end to the horror of the factory fire and to tell their tales. Lily listened, sympathy for the tortured souls weighing heavily on her mind. She came to see that she might give them the tranquility they so desperately needed. Lily and the medium had several seances over the course of the following few weeks, gradually revealing the story of the factory workers and the tragedy that had befallen them. Although it was an emotional and eerie experience, the presence in her apartment seemed to fade with each session. A feeling of calm filled the room on that fateful evening as they conducted their last seance. There were no longer any shadows or whispers, only an overpowering sense of peace. After finding their resolution, the spirits started to fade away, their ethereal bodies vanishing into the void. After all of this, Lily was left in apartment 303, changed. The structure, which had previously inspired fear, has been transformed into a haven of tranquility and recovery. She had discovered her own sense of purpose and closure by assisting the lost souls in finding their way. Now that the haunting of the Harborview apartments had ended, Lily could finally move behind her spooky past. She had overcome her worries and discovered the mysteries concealed in the shadows, coming out of them stronger and with a stronger connection to both the hereafter and the world of the dead. Lily realized she had come out of the shadows with a fresh understanding of life, death, and the mysteries that lie between as she stood on her balcony and looked out over the metropolis that had once filled her with both excitement and fear. She had a story to tell, and an experience she would never forget when the shadows in apartment 303 had finally been banished.